Today's subject is a man who redefined the soul of rock. Neil Young, from Harvest to Rust. Never sleeps. From protest ballads to electric epics, he built a legend on his own terms, introspective, unpredictable, and unapologetically raw. This is the story of Neil Young and what happened to the three children who inherited his name, but never his spotlight. Zeke Young, the son who walked away from the spotlight. Zeke Young was born in September 1972, just as his father's voice had become the anthem of a restless generation. Neil Young was everywhere on the radio, on tour, on the edge of cultural mythology. His mother, Carrie Snodgress, had given up Hollywood to live with Neil in Topanga Canyon. She was fresh off an Oscar nomination, a rising star who traded the spotlight for a wood cabin and a belief in love. But when Zeke was diagnosed with mild cerebral palsy as an infant, the fairy tale ruptured. Neil, never built for stillness, drifted back into music while Carrie stayed, raised their son, and disappeared from public life. In 1975, Carrie went public about the struggle. She was raising Zeke alone while Neil wrote ballads about the breakup. Songs like Motion Pictures and Pardon My Heart were his side of the story, but Zeke never got to tell his. By the 1980s, Zeke was a teenager navigating two worlds, one shaped by medical therapy and special education, the other haunted by a surname that everyone knew but few dared to ask about. He lived with Carrie in Los Angeles, attended mainstream schools, and began experimenting with music on his own terms. While Neil moved on, marrying again, founding the Bridge School for Disabled Children, and having two more children with neurological disorders, Zeke watched from afar. Despite his own diagnosis, he was never invited to the Bridge School stage. He remained distant, perhaps by choice, perhaps by necessity. Yet in the 90s, as he entered adulthood, Zeke made his first quiet moves into the arts. He worked in local production crews, sometimes credited as a grip or set assistant on low-budget films. He played guitar and bass in underground music circles in California, often under different names, avoiding direct association with his father. In 1993, he briefly joined a band called Cornfield, a short-lived folk rock trio that performed in small LA venues. They never released an album, but those who saw them said Zeke had the same stillness on stage that his father had, an intensity that didn't ask for attention, but held it anyway. Through the 2000s, Zeke built a modest but steady career as a behind-the-scenes professional. He worked on lighting setups, location scouting, and occasionally as a sound technician. Never headlining, always moving after Carrie passed away in 2004, Zeke inherited her estate and slipped further into private life. He didn't write a book, he didn't chase interviews, he didn't litigate his family legacy. What he did do was endure quietly, consistently, and on his own terms. In 2016, an indie documentary about life behind famous fathers briefly reached out to him for participation. He declined. Not out of resentment, but because, as one friend put it, Zeke never believed his story needed fixing. Today he lives in California, in a quiet suburb far from the canyon where he was born. In his 50s now, he still plays guitar, still reads the trades, and still answers questions about Neil Young with a simple shrug. But for those who understand Neil Young's lyrics, the sorrow, the distance, the quiet guilt, it's Zeke who haunts the margins. The son who arrived first, the child whose condition shifted Neil's entire trajectory, the name you'll never see in the credits, but one whose shadow runs through the music louder than any guitar ever could. Ben Young, the son who silenced the world and changed it. Ben Young was born in November 1978 into a world already bruised by fame and regret. At that point, Neil Young was 33, newly married to Pegi Morton, and still nursing the guilt of being a distant father to his first son, Zeke. But fate didn't offer Ben a second chance at normalcy. It offered him a challenge no parent could rehearse for. From birth, Ben was diagnosed with quadriplegic cerebral palsy, a severe neurological condition that left him nonverbal and in need of round-the-clock. Neil didn't run this time. He stayed, he watched, he learned. And with Pegi, he rebuilt himself not as a rock icon, but as a full-time father to a son who could never speak his name. Through the 1980s, as Neil toured the world with Crazy Horse and recorded albums like Trans and Landing on Water, Ben was always present, sometimes physically backstage, sometimes invisibly threaded through lyrics that spoke more to pain than glory. In 1986, the year Ben turned 8, Neil and Pegi founded the Bridge School in Hillsborough, California. After being turned away from public schools that couldn't handle their son's needs, that school wasn't just a gesture, it became a national model. Ben was its first student. Through the 1990s, while Neil reclaimed his grunge relevance and shared stages with Pearl Jam, Ben sat beside his mother at the annual Bridge School benefit concerts, always near but never center stage. He couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, but in his silence, he moved the biggest names in music to show up year after year. As he entered adulthood in the 2000s, Ben's condition remained profound, but stable. He lived at home with Pegi, supported by a rotation of dedicated caregivers. Neil often said in interviews that Ben taught him more than any book or song ever could. He taught him rhythm, not as a beat, but as a way of being, the rhythm of feeding, of patience, of tuning into another person without expecting sound in return. In 2010, as Neil was honored again by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he said on stage that everything good he ever built in life started with Ben, but no success is immune to heartbreak. In 2014, Neil filed for divorce from Pegi after 36 years. It shocked the fans. It devastated the Bridge School community. But through it all, Ben remained the link between them. When Pegi passed away in January 2019 after a battle with breast cancer, Neil wrote a brief tribute. It mentioned her music, her strength, and her role as Ben's mother. After her death, Ben's world shifted again. He was placed in a specialized long-term care setting in California, still close to Neil, who had by then married actress Daryl Hannah. Now in his mid-40s, Ben lives in privacy, surrounded by medical support and the quiet legacy of a movement he unknowingly started. He never gave interviews, he never wrote a memoir, but through his presence, Ben Young helped redefine what rock and roll responsibility could look like. He forced one of the most complex musicians of the 20th century to choose between escape and accountability, and Neil Young, for the first time, stayed every dollar raised for accessible education, every headline about inclusion in the arts, every backstage moment where a rock star didn't scream, but simply sat still. It all traces back to Ben. He didn't have a voice, but he gave his father one, Amber Jean Young, the daughter who painted the silence. Amber Jean Young was born in 1984, the youngest child of Neil and Pegi Young, and the only daughter in a family already shaped by silence, sacrifice, and fame. By the time she came into the world, her older brother Ben was 6 years old and entirely dependent on full-time care. The Young household was not glamorous, it was intense. Love was real, but attention was divided. While Neil balanced studio sessions with sleepless nights, and Pegi managed both the home and the early stages of the Bridge School project, Amber quietly found her own language through art. She didn't have a disability like her brothers, but she grew up in a home where everything revolved around those who needed more, and so she gave less. Less trouble, less noise, but more observation. By age 5, she was already drawing to express things that could be said at dinner. As a teenager in the late 1990s, she often stood in the wings of the Bridge School benefit concerts, not performing, but watching, absorbing how music could build community, how caregiving could become culture, and how being a Young meant being both visible and invisible at the same time. Unlike her father, she didn't chase the spotlight. Unlike her mother, she didn't sing. Amber chose canvas over chords. After graduating high school in California, she studied visual arts and literature, eventually earning a master's degree from Mills College. Her early works explored memory, lineage, and isolation, not in grand statements, but in textured, layered detail. In the 2010s, Amber began exhibiting in small galleries across the Bay Area. Her pieces rarely mentioned her family name, but their themes were unmistakable: the fragility of presence, the burden of caretaking, the search for self within systems too loud to hear you. In interviews, she spoke softly, precisely when asked about being Neil Young's daughter. She never denied it, but she always redirected to her work. She had watched her father command stadiums and her mother run institutions. She had watched her brother Ben exist outside language. Amber's mission was different. She wanted to create spaces where complexity could sit quietly and be seen. In 2018, she exhibited a series called Field Studies, blending photography, sculpture, and handwritten text to examine the heritage of silence, a clear but gentle reference to her upbringing. The art world took notice. Critics praised her for turning generational weight into personal language. In 2020, during the pandemic, she held a virtual exhibition addressing environmental grief and cultural inheritance, subtle nods to her father's activism and her own growing voice. Though she has never been part of Neil's touring life or musical collaborations, she has participated in family foundations and occasionally appeared at events honoring Pegi's work. Now in her 40s, Amber Jean Young lives in California, working as both an artist and curator. She teaches, creates, and remains fiercely independent. Amber didn't rebel. She didn't retreat. She didn't inherit fame by force. Instead, she took the weight of her family, her father's genius, her mother's strength, her brother's fragility, and translated it into form, texture, and space. She built her own stage, and in doing so, she gave the Young legacy something it never had before, a quiet, deliberate echo that could be felt, not heard. 3 children. One lived in silence but became the reason their father stayed. One walked away from fame's shadow and built a life in quiet defiance. And one watched it all unfold from hospital rooms to concert halls and turned the weight of that legacy into art. Zeke carried the distance. Ben carried the purpose. Amber carried the translation. His songs gave them a shadow. Their lives gave him depth. If you found this breakdown powerful and want more deep dives into the hidden lives of Hollywood's forgotten children, subscribe to Hidden Heirs. Your support brings these invisible stories to light. Thanks for listening.